Hello everybody, Tommyruin here and welcome back to another video. In this video I'm going to be going over a shadow based spec that I have been running recently for PvE on Project Ascension. Now this spec I found really fun because it combines doing some insane shadow bolt damage and also weaving in dots to boost up that shadow damage that you're doing throughout a fight. It's got some complexity because you have to manage your dots, you have to keep them up at all times when possible, and then you weave in your shadow bolts to do that explosive shadow damage when you can. So I found it really fun. It's been quite an engaging spec to play. There's lots to track, there's lots to do. So yeah, I've really enjoyed it and hopefully you guys will too. Before I go into any more detail, please do remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'm trying to get to 10k subscribers, so if you could subscribe if you haven't already, I'd really appreciate it. I found recently, looking through my analytics, that most people who watch my videos aren't subscribed, so if you could just hit that red button, I'd really appreciate it. But now let's look into the talents. So, starting off in the Druid tree, we have Balance of Power. Now this is in most caster specs. It gives you 4% chance to hit, which is huge, because if you don't hit your spells, then you won't do any damage. So 4% hit is really good, and it also reduces your damage taken from spells by 2%. In the Hunter tree, we have Black Arrow. Now I've gone over Black Arrow in another video, which I'll link to. It should be up on the screen, and this increases the damage you do to the target by 8%, and it also does shadow damage, so it has that synergy with the build, as this is a shadow based build. But yeah, Black Arrow will increase the damage you do to the target by 8% over for 15 seconds, so it's a really nice filler ability that you use when it's off cooldown. In the Mage tree, we have Focus Magic for the crit chance it gives, and we have Arcane Power for the damage burst cooldown that provides. And obviously, like with most builds, we're twinning this with Power Infusion in the Priest, which we'll come to later. In the Paladin tree, we have 3 out of 3 for Ardent Defender, and I've gone over this in a few builds before as well. This just saves your life. You want to pick it up in every build. In the Priest tree, now this is where it starts getting a little more interesting because we start seeing some of the shadowy influences on the build. So in the Discipline tree, we have Focused Power. Now for 2 points here, we're increasing our damage and healing done by Holy and Shadow spells by 4%. So 4% shadow damage for 2 talent essence. That's pretty huge. We also have Power Infusion, which, like I said earlier, twins with Arcane Power for that 20% damage, 20% spell haste, burst cooldown. In Shadow Priest, we have Shadow Weaving, which increases our shadow damage by 2%, stacking up to 5 times. So it gives us 10% shadow damage when we use our Shadow Priest spells. And in this build, we're weaving in Shadow Priest and Warlock shadow spells, so we get a mix of both. And we're using the Shadow Priest spells to build up these Shadow Weaving stacks to get us 10% increased damage. We then have Shadow Form, which again increases our shadow damage by 10% and reduces our threat by 30%. So this is really nice. And it also gives the Shadow Web Pain, Devouring Plague and Vampiric Touch spells the ability to critically hit. So we get crit from this with our Shadow Priest dots, and then we also get 10% shadow damage and threat reduction, which, yeah, is nice for 1 talent essence. We also get Vampiric Touch, which is another shadow damage dot, and this one actually does a fair amount of damage, and as you can see, there's no other investment here to increase our Shadow Priest dots. It's just shadow damage from Shadow Weaving, shadow damage from Shadow Form, and then we've picked up Vampiric Touch because its base damage is really nice. And the other thing about Vampiric Touch, which is quite nice, is when the target has Vampiric Touch on them, and then you Mind Blast them, you get mana back. So that's really nice. In the Rogue tree, we have Hunger for Blood. This is just a 5% damage increase, which is available to use when the target has a bleed. It doesn't have to be your bleed, so if someone in the group runs a bleed, then you can apply Hunger for Blood, and it gives you 5% damage increase. In the Shaman trees, we have Mental Quickness for the attack power to spell power conversion. So we get bonus spell damage equal to 15% of our melee attack power, and like with every caster build, you should be going full strength. Okay, so in the Warlock tree where most of the stuff goes down, we have 3 out of 3 improved corruption. So in the talent calculator here, this shows 3 out of 5. In game, you'll see it's 3 out of 3. And this increases the damage done by corruption by 9%. And it also allows corruption to benefit from haste, which is really nice. We then get 3 out of 3 Shadow Mastery, which is again 6% shadow damage. Eradication gives you a 15% chance when corruption deals damage to increase your spell casting speed by 20%, and this allows you to fire off your shadow bolts so much faster. For 1 point, Pandemic allows us to crit with our corruption spells, so that one is really nice to pick up. We then have Molten Core, which when corruption deals damage, we can get the Molten Core effect, which empowers our next 3 Shadow Bolts, and this will increase the critical strike chance of those Shadow Bolts by 30% and also reduces the cast time. So they're really fast, really hard hitting Shadow Bolts. In the Destruction tree, we have Improved Shadow Bolt, which increases the damage done by our Shadow Bolt spells by 15%, and it also causes the target to become vulnerable, increasing the critical strike chance against the target by 5%. So that's a group-wide buff, and it means that the target is 5% more likely to be hit by a critical strike. So it's a nice buff you bring to the raid, and it also increases your Shadow Bolt damage done. We then have Bane, which reduces the casting time of Shadow Bolt by 0.5 seconds, and it reduces the mana cost of all your destruction spells by 10%. Now that mana cost reduction is a nice bonus, but it's not the main point we're picking up this for. It's for the Shadow Bolt cast time reduction. We then have Ruin, which increases this critical strike damage bonus of our destruction spells by 100%, so our crits do bigger damage. And obviously with Molten Core, which gives us an increased critical strike chance, this means that we will have more critical strikes doing more damage with Ruin. Devastation is a 1.5% crit increase, which is really nice. And then finally we have Shadow and Flame, which means that our Shadow Bolt will gain an additional 20% of our bonus spell damage effects. So that is all of the talents that we're picking for the spells. I'll put a link to this build calculator down in the description so you can go and have a look at the spells as well. I haven't gone through all of those because they're fairly self-explanatory, but I will go over the rotation later on and you'll see how all the spells fit in. But next up, let's take a look at the random enchants. Okay, so the random enchants I've gone for are Pain and Suffering, which allows Mind Blast to refresh Shadow Word Pain on the target. The tooltip is misleading. Mind Blast does actually work here. I've then gone for 3 Improved Shadow Bolt, which increases the damage done by our Shadow Bolt spells by 9% when we have 3. I've then got Shadow and Flame, which gives our Shadow Bolt an extra 18% of our bonus spell damage effects when you've got 3 of them. I've got Dark Embrace, which increases our shadow damage done by Shadow Bolt and Mind Blast on targets affected by corruption by 9% when we've got 3 of them. I have then got Darkness, which is just a flat 3% shadow damage increase. And I have got Eradication, I've got 3 of this one, and this increases the haste granted by our Eradication talent by 12% when you have the max rank one. So that takes the Eradication buff up to a 32% haste increase, which is pretty hefty. And finally then, I've got Everlasting Affliction, which gives us a chance to refresh our corruption with Shadow Bolt, and it doesn't give you a chance, it refreshes your corruption with Shadow Bolt, which is good because this means basically once you've done your opening rotation, you don't have to cast Shadow Word Pain or corruption again. You can just cast Shadow Bolt and Mind Blast instead, and that'll refresh your dots. I've then got Balance of Power, which increases our hit chance by 2%. And as a legendary RE, there isn't really one that fit this build, in my opinion. I've gone for Spellslinger, just because it does some damage, and it also gives us clear casting, which is quite nice. It procs a few times during a fight, which saves maybe 1 or 2 life taps. But you could go for any general legendary random enchant, in my opinion, in this one. If they were to buff Whispers of the Old Gods, the one that spawns Enzoth tentacles from your Shadow Word Pains, that would probably be my favourite one, but the damage that RE deals is rather minuscule. It does nothing, basically. It gives you a haste buff, and that's about it. Okay, so let's look at the rotation. Unlike other builds, this build has a lot of setup. So you want to be getting your shadow weaving stacks up to 5, giving you a 10% damage increase, because this build utilises snapshotting. So what we're doing here, we're using our Shadow Web Pain. That gives us 1 stack of shadow weaving. Then we use our corruption, which can proc eradication, which gives us more haste. Then we use our vampiric touch. Then we mind blast, and then we Shadow Web Pain again. Then we should be on 4 stacks of shadow weaving. So we Shadow Web Pain once more, and this is when we start our burst cooldown. So we pop our arcane power and our power infusion, and then we reapply our corruption and our Shadow Web Pain and our vampiric touch, because with the extra 20% damage that gets applied to the dots, and when we're refreshing our Shadow Web Pain and our corruption with Shadow Bolt and Mind Blast, the damage increase, the power amp that you get from arcane power, gets saved in those dots. So your Shadow Web Pain and your corruption are always going to have plus 30% damage from shadow weaving and from arcane power. So this is something you need to get right at the beginning of your fight, or your damage is just going to be a lot less because of it. But once you've done that, you're then shadow bolting and casting Mind Blast to refresh your Shadow Web Pain, refreshing Vampiric Touch, and just keeping that rotation going. It took me a good while to learn how to do the opener of this rotation, but once you get into the flow of things and you start building up those shadow weaving stacks, and then pop your cooldowns and apply the really heavy hitting dots, and then you can start going through the motions of shadow bolting and mind blasting and just refreshing Vampiric Touch when you need to, and you'll start to see that your damage just ramps up. It's got quite a slow start compared to most builds, but then you just zoom past them because your damage ramps up, and you start doing some crazy shadow bolts when your Eradication and your Molten Core procs. And then, yeah, if you time that with your burst cooldowns when you're past your first set, and even if you get them in your first set, if you get a Molten Core and Eradication proc when you get your Power Infusion and Arcane Power up, you'll see some serious damage pumped out, because Shadow Bolt can do some hefty hits with this build. What I'll do is, in the description, I'll place my Weakauras that you'll see on screen. I find them very helpful for tracking things like the dot uptime and when you need to Mind Blast and Vampiric Touch and so on. So if that'll come in handy, I'll put that down in the description. But yeah, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's a spec that I'm having so much fun with, so I hope you will too. But thank you very much for watching, and I will see you all very soon.